Welcome to the video tutorial of the Queen of Hearts Tote, a stylish and structured handbag inspired by a designer brand. This brings a touch of luxury and elegance into a versatile handmade accessory. In this step-by-step tutorial, I will guide you through the entire process of making this tote. You can line the bag for a polished interior or make it unlined with non-fraying fabrics. This is the most recommended option for beginners. The line version can even be reversible, letting you play with textures and colors. The bag is designed with shorter handles for a chic and structured look, but if you prefer a more relaxed fit, simply elongate the straps to your desired length for added comfort. So, to get started, let's jump right into the materials you'll need to bring this bag to life. First, the main fabric. Choose a structure, medium to heavyweight and stable fabrics, since they will help you creating the defined shape of the heart and will ensure the bag has a sturdy structure. For this sample, I'm going to be using double-faced suede knit. Next, your lining or internal fabric. Choose a medium weight fabric that complements your main fabric. In my case, I'm going to continue using the same fabric for myself and for my lining. Next, interfacing, to add extra structure and firmness. You can choose between a fusible interfacing for an easy application or a sew-on interfacing for more durability. Optionally, you can add an extra support material such as crinoline, foam, or felt to get a stiffer and more structured result. In the handbook, you'll find a suggested list of recommended options for fabrics, interfacings, and extra support materials that you can use as a reference when making your project. Choose a thread that matches the color of your fabric. And finally, the pattern that you will find linked below in the description box. Before cutting, iron your fabric with enough steam to pre-shrink it. Pin and mark your patterns considering grain line. Since the seam allowance is already included, just cut the pieces following the edges of the pattern and the instructions listed on each piece. The front and back pattern pieces will be cut at least 3 times, once in the main fabric, once in the interlining, and optionally once more in the extra support material for added structure, while the front and back lining pieces will be cut only once. It's important to note that although they look identical to the main fabric pieces, the lining pieces are slightly smaller to ensure a cleaner final look. Now, take the pocket piece and search all the edges to prevent any fraying. If you are working with fabric that doesn't fray, such is my case, you can use a pinking shears to cut the edges instead. Next, prepare the pocket by folding the top edge down 3/4 of an inch and stitch it in place as close as possible to the raw edge of the fold. Next, fold the bottom edge towards the wrong side of the fabric 1/4 of an inch and press it. Thus, bulk in the fold of the pocket, you can trim the corner of the bottom edge before folding the sides on top of it. Then, fold the sides of the pocket 1/4 of an inch towards the wrong side of the fabric as well and press them into place. Now position the pocket on the lining in the suggested placement that you will find on the pattern. Pin or clip the pocket in place. You can position the pocket on the lining or you can position it on the main fabric if you want the pocket to be visible. And then edge stitch around the pocket to secure it. To reinforce the top corners of the pocket, create a stitch following a triangle shape around the top edges. Add the interfacing to the wrong side of the main fabric. To add extra structure, place a support material such as crinoline, foam between the main fabric and the interfacing, sandwiched in between. If you are using fusible interfacing, place the glue side down on the wrong side of the fabric and press it with an iron on the appropriate heat setting for your fabric type. If using sew-on interlining, place it on the wrong side of the fabric, pin it or clip it to secure it in place, and sew around the perimeter with a straight stitch, leaving about 1/8 of an inch from the edge to keep it in place. For best results when sewing the interface into the fabric, avoid backstitching or pivoting the fabric. Simply stitch along the straight edges to prevent distorting the fabric. Take one main fabric piece and one lining and place them together with right side facing. Stitch along the external handle area between the notches that you will find on the pattern and the internal cutout, using 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. At the beginning of the hanger, leave from 1 to maximum 1.5 inches opening unstitched. This will allow you to clean finish the handle later on. Clip at the notches and trim the seam allowance to reduce bulk, which is especially recommended for thick fabrics. Carefully trim down the seam allowance along the stitched areas, but being mindful to not cut too close to the stitching area. Cut a small notch at the pointed area where the heart shapes form. This will help the fabric turn more smoothly and maintain a crispy shape of the heart later on. On the interior curve of the handle, clip small notches along the seam allowance to help release the tension and allow the fabric to lay smoothly when flipped right side out. Carefully flip the fabric right side out, ensuring all edges are fully turned. The handle area will require some patience since it's a small space, so gently work it through using a turning loop, chopsticks, or your fingers to help push out the curves and all the areas. Give it a good press and repeat the same procedure on both the front and back pieces. If by any chance you notice extra bulk along the seam edges, you can further grade the seams by trimming a bit more from the interfacing and extra support material layers. With right side facing, close the handles separately, first sewing the main fabric handles together and then the lining handles. Align the raw edges of each handle and stitch along the open section using 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Next, to close the hole in the handles, flip the handles right side in through the open section to access the raw edges from the inside. This step requires also patience due to the small space, so take your time. Once the handle is flipped, align the center seam of the main fabric and the lining at the center seam of the handle, and starting exactly where the previous stitching ends, sew along the remaining open section using 1/4 inch of seam allowance, carefully closing the gap in both sides. Then trim the seam allowance to reduce bulk and flip the handles right side out. Now open your piece so you have access to the main fabric and the lining separately. With right side facing, align the front main fabric with the back main fabric and the front lining piece with the back lining piece. Pin or clip the edges to keep them in place. Sew along the edges using 1/4 inch of seam allowance, starting exactly at the notch where the previous stitch ended and continuing until you reach the other notch. On the lining piece, leave an opening of at least 4 inches. This will depend on the fabric thickness unstitched to allow for flipping the back right side out later on. Trim the seam allowance and clip notches, especially around the curved areas. When trimming the seam allowance, do not trim the seam allowance of the opening, as we need it to close the escape hole once the bag is flipped right side out. Then flip the bag right side out through the opening left in the lining. Carefully pull out the corners and shape edges of the lining and main fabric using a turning loop, a knitting needle, or chopsticks to ensure a well-defined heart shape. Once fully turned, press the edges with enough steam to set the shape and create crisp and clean lines. Then fold and press the seam allowance of the escape hole inwards to prepare it for closing. Next, close the gap using a ladder stitch for an invisible finish. To do this, thread a hand sewing needle with a thread that matches the color of your fabric. Start by inserting the needle from the inside of one of the folds to hide the knot. Then take small stitches by picking up a bit of fabric from one fold edge, then moving directly across to take a stitch on the opposite fold edge. Continue this back and forth motion, creating a ladder-like pattern. Pull the thread gently every few stitches to close the gap seamlessly. Once finished, secure the thread a couple of times and tuck it inside the seam before trimming. The final top stitching must be done in 2 steps. In the first one, we'll top stitch the main fabric and the lining separately. We're going to start from the point where they are no longer joined, and using 1/8 or quarter of an inch of seam allowance, we are going to sew close to the edge to give a clean professional finish. Next, we're going to insert the lining inside the bag, ensuring it sits smoothly. And then we're going to do our second step, which will be top stitching along the handles and the areas where the main fabric and lining are joined, making sure the stitching line meet perfectly at the end points. This will create a seamless look, making it appear as a single continuous stitch for a polished final result. Although this final top stitching is recommended to reinforce the tote, it will depend on your personal preference and the thickness of your fabric. Consider whether your sewing machine can handle the layers, as thicker fabrics might require adjustments. To keep the lining secure in place, stitch in the ditch along the handle center seam for a clean and seamless finish. Finally, give your garment an overall press to ensure all the seams are crisp and the fabric sits smoothly. And that's it, your Queen of Heart tote is ready to use. I hope you had fun sewing along with me. If you have any question, please leave it below. I will be happy to help. And if you make this bag, please tag me on Instagram. I absolutely love to see it. Thank you for watching. Have a happy sewing, and I will see you pretty soon in the next video.